Let's talk a little bit more here about what we can be doing to support NB folks in their healthcare. I mean, what are some short-term solutions? Because I know that we're talking about like big systemic problems that are really,
Hmm.
they extend beyond healthcare. They really talk about the way we see gender as a culture and as a society. But uh, is there a way to, without upending the whole apple cart, actually support NB folks in the way that they access healthcare under our current system?
Yeah, there are a number of different ways depending on what position you're in healthcare. And stuff. If you are a healthcare provider and stuff, one way that you can make things easier is to make sure that you ask people their pronouns, ask them uh, like what specific language they would like you to use, and that sort of stuff, just to let them know that you are a person that they can come talk to. One of my favorite things about my doctor is that, like, when I came out to her, she was like, "Oh, okay. Do you want references to our gender care coordinator? Like, what sort of things are you looking for?" And stuff,
Aw.
and made a note like in my file that I'm they them, and everything. And so like that's in my medical records, and it was really great to know that coming out to her wasn't going to be a battle because of how she had treated me beforehand. So that's something that individual healthcare providers can do to help their patients feel more comfortable. It's just that sort of bedside banner thing. Um, but there's also for like people who are allies and things like that, you can volunteer to be their advocate if they are in the hospital or something and they need somebody alongside them, because being in the hospital is really tiring, and if you have somebody else there who's willing to say her name is this or whatever like that, that can be really helpful. And that's something you can discuss with your friend beforehand, if there's any sort of thing with that. And then also to provide resources for non-binary people of the language that they need, the specific things that they need to ask for. There are lots of online resources for binary trans folks for what specific like things they need to ask for in a healthcare situation, because sometimes you go in and you're like, I don't know, I just want to transition, I just want to do some stuff, and there are a bunch of different things. So making sure that people have access to that information is really important, in terms of just making these little individual changes to help people navigate the system.
Yeah, are there any particular strategies for NB folks to better navigate these systems? I mean, what would you recommend to somebody who's watching this who
Yeah.
is non-binary themselves
Mhm.
and is not really sure how to talk to a doctor about some of these issues?
Yeah, I would first talk to other non-binary people about their experiences and stuff. There are, I believe, in the show notes, we're going to have a couple of Facebook groups for non-binary people navigating transition care,
Hmm.
and stuff. And so those are a lot of really good resources. But I would also remember that you are the expert on you. Your doctor
Mm-hmm.
may
Mm,
be able to run
brilliant.
tests and may
It's
have
such an important
knowledge
message.
to do diagnosis, but you are the one who is in your head and you know what your gender is, you know what you're thinking about, or you know you need to talk to somebody who is a therapist or something to qualify, to like figure that all out. So remember that you're the expert in this situation and you have the power to say no if you're feeling pushed into something, if you are feeling shoved into a path that you don't want to take. You have the power to stop it if you want to. If somebody's like, oh, okay, so we'll get you on tea or whatever and stuff, you have the power to stop and wait as well if you are nervous about something.
Yeah, and you mentioned those Facebook groups that are in the show notes for this episode that
Mm-hmm.
I would invite people who are looking for resources to check out. But to me, that highlights maybe the most effective part of all of this that I've seen, which is just self-advocacy groups, being in
Mm-hmm.
community. I mean, I want to say in particular, the non-binary community is remarkably impressive at how well it has self-identified and organized and
Mm-hmm.
is self-supporting. And I would say to anybody who is outside of the conventional gender expectations,
Mhm.
if you are not talking to other folks of your gender or who are queer allies alongside you, you're really missing out on so many opportunities to just better understand these systems. We couldn't possibly address all of the questions on a show like
Mhm.
this, but I would say that there's so much value in being a part of a group like that and having other people to talk to for good referrals, for good advice, for honestly just support around a lot of these topics, and an opportunity to bitch to somebody who actually understands what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say, if you want to come on Twitter and like complain with me or something, I am more than happy to have more non-binary people around.
Hmm. Well, I know that a lot of this conversation can feel like a referendum on how we treat gender as a whole in our society. And I know we don't have time here to give like a full course on gender theory, but what would you encourage the audience watching to be aware of in this space?
Yeah, I would encourage people to watch for how some things are unnecessarily gendered. Like what I mentioned with like calling a pap smear slash gynecological visit a well woman visit. I mean, that's a euphemism that was maybe good in the 50s, but it doesn't work now for a gender diverse uh, community that we have. It didn't work well then anyway, I would say, either, because it was too euphemistic. So using the specific language that is about the specific anatomy or whatever that's referenced and things like that is really just much more precise and more empowering, I think, because it's
Mm.
like, oh, people with uteruses tend to experience this, can let people who are in that group either select in or select out in terms of what they're going to listen to, and stuff like that. And that's much more precise than saying women or whatever like that. So that's something that I would love just on a linguistic level to see changed, is just how we talk about these things.
Yeah, I
Because,
feel like
yeah.
there's a lot of overlap too with what our caller was talking about,
Mhm.
with how to talk to your children about sex. And one of the things that I tried to do, and one of the things that I try to tell others to do, is not to use those infantilizing terms like pee
Mhm.
pee and wee wee. Like, refer to the anatomy as it is.
Hmm.
Make it known that saying penis, saying vagina, even 20 times in one podcast is perfectly okay. It's a
Yeah.
Yeah.
part of the human anatomy, and you don't have to blush when you say it,
Yep.
right? You've probably got one or the other, so it doesn't have to be weird to talk about it.
Yeah. And that's something we've done. My brother and sister-in-law have done with their kids, and like I've supported them in that, is like just letting them have the language that they need to describe things, and
Yes.
that includes not
Yes.
stigmatizing things about gender and sexuality and
Right.
stuff. Like my 10-year-old niece the other day was apparently asked, "How does gay sex work?" And my sister-in-law sat down and explained, like, this is how two cis men would, do it. And she was like, "Oh, okay, that's kind of strange," but because she's a
I mean,
10-year-old.
as if
Yeah,
straight sex is not weird,
yeah,
as if
so
the
like,
idea of like talking meat just slapping against each other is not like inherently weird and gross and
yeah,
silly and fun and beautiful and sexy.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where it's just like, oh, okay. And then she moved on and started doing whatever she wanted to do with that day. It
Right.
doesn't have to be like this anxious, hard conversation.
No.
And I know so many folks can feel like, oh my gosh, like is the particular pronoun that we use are the if we say a word like woman instead of a person with a uterus, like does that really matter? Do we really need to cater to a small minority? And first of all, yes. Yes, we do
Mm-hmm.
need to cater to all human beings. That's what being inclusive is about. But also there are like meaningful impacts to these things. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, here in Texas, and I mean, of course, nationwide, we've been having a renewed conversation around abortion. and even media outlets or pundits or people that you might generally look to as good examples of how to use language appropriately are oftentimes talking about how now women can no longer get abortions and about how this is a women's health issue and things like that. And that really does lead to negative outcomes for people with uteruses that do not identify as women, and makes it even that much harder to access these services that are I guess, evaporating in so many ways. That's if we want to get me mad enough to unplug my microphone again, we can keep talking about this this ongoing abortion issue here in Texas.
Yeah.
But I do want to stress that yes, words can seem like a unsubstantive issue to get worked up about, but words mean things. They drive these conversations, and then they drive the decisions that those conversations lead to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Language serves us, not the other way around, for sure.
Yeah, an
Yeah.
important reminder. Otherwise, unless either of you have any more to say, I know that this is obviously like, how do we identify gender in our society is much too big of a conversation for this podcast. But I want to give Nate a chance to jump back into the phones, unless there is anything else huge that you feel just needs to be said in this space.
Yeah, we're ready, but go ahead, Dianna.
Yeah, I did want to comment on the abortion thing. I think a lot of cis people get confused because the motivation for making these abortion restrictions is absolutely about controlling women's bodies. It is based out of misogyny, but it doesn't just affect women. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Right, where like the motivations are coming from misogyny. That's absolutely okay to call out. But just don't say that everybody affected is a woman.
No, important to say. And, again, we're never going to be angry at somebody for stumbling over a word. We had a conversation with our first caller, Lee, and perhaps the most important idea that I wanted to leave with Lee was just the significance of not being harsh on yourself here, because when you start to beat yourself up, you only create more anxiety and more tension, and you increase the likelihood of making a mistake. I mean, this is the basic notion of self-compassion. And so if somebody stumbles over some of these words, that's fine. I'm perfectly okay with that. That doesn't mean it isn't important to continue trying and to continue to emphasize the significance of language as we have these conversations.
Yeah, of course. Like, one thing that I've said when talking to trans or NB people, especially with RFR, is that intent is everything. So, if your family that you've just presented new information to is stumbling over your pronouns or dead naming you or whatever, but their intent and if their intent is good, if they're noble, if they apologize when they do it, right? Like, you don't owe it to them to let it go, but you might want to consider cutting them some slack if their intent is good. And their intent is going to be pretty easy to suss out. You're going to know what they mean, I think, 9 times out of 10.
Fair to say.
But yes, we do have callers on the line. We do have another note from the mailbag that I think we can probably wrap up pretty quick. So Jared and Al, hold on. Your turn is coming. Okay. Hold on. We are going to get to you real soon. But one real quick item from the mailbag that I want to get to here, if I can bring this up. I am the worst co-host ever. Okay, so question from our mailbag. Can somebody be non-binary and or gender fluid and still use she, her pronouns? Is it wrong? This is a bit of a non sequitur. Is it wrong for the big bad evil person of a story or a game to be a perfect example of someone who is gender fluid or non-binary? And the example they give is a shapeshifter like Mystique from the X-Men. This stems from an online role-playing game. our writer is playing, and they don't want to feed into negative stereotypes about the LGBTQ community. That we appreciate.
Mhm.
Dianna, what do you think?
Yeah, on the first one, yes, absolutely. You use what pronouns feel most comfortable for you. I know lots of people who are non binary who still use she, her, who use she, they, whatever. You're good. You're fine. As far as the big bad question, my main thing with that sort of thing is to make sure that the evilness of that person isn't extending from their identity as a marginalized person. Like the reason that they're being portrayed as evil isn't because they're trans or non-binary. I think perhaps one of the most famous examples is the Ace Ventura Pet Detective, where the big bad in that movie is a trans woman, and that is the entire basis for her being seen as evil throughout it, and it's absolutely horrible and transphobic. But if you have a villain who just happens to be this sort of identity, that's fine. I mean,
Yeah.
there can be bad trans people, there can be bad non-binary people. It's a thing. We don't have to
Yeah.
be like these good paragons of it. I think of how like Ursula, I believe, from The Little Mermaid was purposefully modeled like on Divine as
Mhm.
like a
Very
yes.
queer-coded.
Yes.
and I freaking love her in that because it
Who
allows
doesn't
her.
love
It's not,
Ursula?
yeah, and it's not because she's modeled on like this drag queen aspect that she's bad. It's like that's
Mhm.
just part of her fabulousness. So
Absolutely. You literally stole the
If
words
we
from
wanted
my
to do an
mouth there.
entire episode just breaking down the gender implications and the political implications of Disney's The Little Mermaid, we
Yep.
can absolutely do that show. I'm here for it. But
Oh,
no,
can I be
for
on that
tonight,
show,
I agree
Christy?
completely. Yeah, I think when we talk about like villains being queer coded and these different things, and wanting to not have queer villains and all of that, it's more about not having all of our villains be queer, right? It's
Yes.
about not having
Yes.
the only representations of queer people being villains. Certainly, there are queer folks that are assholes. I can
Yeah.
recommend plenty of people to fit that stereotype. It's absolutely true. There are plenty
There's
of
one
cis people that
co-hosting
are
your
assholes.
podcast, Christy.
Yeah, it's a real thing. I mean, queer folks can be anything else. I think the challenge is in making sure that that's not the only view. And if you are putting together a game night, or if you are writing your Dungeons and Dragons quest, like whatever character you want to use is fine and great and wonderful. Just be mindful of the fact that so many queer folks never get to see themselves represented in these things as anything other than the bad guy. So that doesn't mean that you can't have a queer bad guy. Just keep all of that in mind.
Yeah,
But
I think
yeah,
we nailed that one. Yeah.